The political con, a game of promises, illusions, and manipulation. Politics is often described as the art of the possible, but in practice, it frequently becomes the art of deception. Politicians across the globe, and especially in the United States, routinely make lofty promises that they know will never materialize. From pledging sweeping tax cuts to vowing universal health care, political promises are more often tools of manipulation than genuine commitments. Meanwhile, voters fall into the same trap election after election, believing in rhetoric that sounds good but rarely holds up against legislative reality. This essay explores the phenomenon of the political con, the mechanisms through which it operates, and how figures like Donald Trump stand out by disrupting, or at least appearing to disrupt, this pattern. 1. The Congress and Senate, the convenient scapegoats. American politicians are notorious for promising voters the moon, knowing full well that the real power to enact change lies with Congress and the Senate. Campaigns are filled with sweeping claims like, "I will lower taxes," or "I will ensure affordable health care for all," but the reality is more complicated. The checks and balances system ensures that even the most well-intentioned proposals are subjected to political wrangling, amendments, and sometimes complete rejection. For instance, Barack Obama's campaign promise of a public health care option was scrapped during the fight to pass the Affordable Care Act. Similarly, Joe Biden pledged student loan forgiveness, but the initiative stalled after legal challenges and resistance in Congress. Politicians often hide behind legislative gridlock, blaming opposition parties or procedural hurdles. However, the truth is that many promises were never meant to be fulfilled. They were simply tools to secure votes. As the saying goes, a promise made is a promise broken, especially in politics. 2. The art of talking without saying anything. One of the most common techniques politicians employ to maintain control is their mastery of evasion. When asked a direct question, many politicians respond with rehearsed talking points, anecdotes, or vague platitudes that never actually address the question. They stretch their answers so far and wide that, by the end, the original question is lost. This is a classic feature of the political con, making voters believe they have been heard without offering any real clarity or commitment. For example, during presidential debates, it is common to see candidates sidestep questions about controversial policies. A question about raising the minimum wage might devolve into a lengthy discourse on economic opportunities and job growth without addressing whether they will actually raise wages. Bill Clinton's famous response during the Monica Lewinsky scandal, "It depends on what the meaning of is a textbook example of deflecting through ambiguity. This skill allows politicians to avoid accountability while maintaining the illusion of engagement. 3. Voters as willing victims. The endless cycle of deception. Despite decades of broken promises and deceptive rhetoric, voters continue to support the same politicians or political parties, hoping for change that never comes. This phenomenon raises a crucial question. Who is to blame? Are politicians the sole villains, or are voters complicit in their own deception? The political con depends on the belief that this time will be different, that a new leader or party will finally deliver on the promises that past politicians failed to fulfill. An illustrative example is the repeated promises of tax cuts. Politicians, both Democratic and Republican, have promised to lower taxes without compromising essential services. Yet, once elected, they either fail to deliver the cuts or implement them in ways that primarily benefit the wealthy. Ronald Reagan's and George W. Bush's tax cuts, for instance, did little to ease the burden on the working class, despite campaign rhetoric to the contrary. Nonetheless, voters continue to buy into the same narrative every election cycle. This pattern is not limited to the U.S. Countries like the UK and France also see politicians rise to power on the back of grand promises that evaporate after Election Day. 4. Trump as a disruptor, a doer, not a talker. Donald Trump, for better or worse, disrupted the typical political con by presenting himself as a doer rather than a talker. His appeal lay in the perception that he would take action where others merely offered words. Whether building a wall on the U.S.-Mexico border, pulling out of international agreements, or renegotiating trade deals, Trump's approach was defined by action, sometimes reckless, but always decisive. Unlike many politicians who rely on polished speeches, Trump's bluntness resonated with voters tired of empty rhetoric. However, even Trump was not immune to the realities of political constraints. While he did take steps to implement many of his promises, such as the border wall and trade renegotiations, much of his agenda was stalled or watered down by Congress. Still, his supporters viewed him as someone who tried, a stark contrast to politicians who never seemed to move beyond promises. This perception allowed him to retain a loyal base, despite controversies and unfulfilled pledges. 5. Breaking free from the political con, a challenge for democracy. The political con thrives because voters are willing to believe in it, and politicians are incentivized to exploit that belief. Breaking this cycle requires a more informed electorate, one that demands accountability and resists the allure of easy promises. Citizens need to recognize that real change is often slow, messy, and requires more than campaign slogans. Voters must learn to distinguish between genuine commitments and manipulative rhetoric, and they should demand transparency from candidates. Moreover, structural reforms, such as stricter campaign finance laws, independent fact-checking bodies, and greater legislative transparency, can help limit the scope of the political con. Politicians should not be able to rely on ambiguity and evasiveness to maintain their power. Only when voters and politicians alike are held to higher standards can the cycle of deception begin to break. Conclusion. The political con is a persistent feature of democratic politics, particularly in the United States. Politicians make promises they know will be blocked or diluted, evade direct questions with skillful rhetoric, and rely on voters to forget or forgive their broken promises. Figures like Donald Trump disrupt this dynamic to some extent, but even he could not escape the constraints of political reality. In the end, the only way to overcome the political con is for voters to become more discerning and demand better from their leaders. Until that happens, the cycle of deception will continue and politicians will keep talking the talk, while doing little of what they promise.